Hello, everyone. My name is Pierre from the Lean Hire podcast, and today I have another YC founder with me. It is Matt from Pilot. Matt, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's great to be on.
And I just saw a website where we just talked about this, where you can put in the last name of someone, and this is very helpful for someone who might not be fully fluent in Polish, I guess. It's so your name is Matt Drozdzynski. I think that is correct.
Yeah,
I hope.
that's close
And
enough.
my last name is not spellable, so we don't even try that. But so Matt is from Poland, or his parents. He came from Poland, and then was moving across Europe for quite a bunch until he landed in San Francisco. So tell me more about your life abroad. How was it like going to all these places when growing up and becoming an entrepreneur?
Yeah. In some ways it kind of felt inevitable for me. It was kind of I was always into computers. I started coding very early on and joined all of these different communities. I think I was very much into Ubuntu and Linux at the time, and that was before I discovered Macs and kind of got on that bandwagon. And I think I was actually kind of getting into programming at the time that Ruby on Rails was really coming up, right? So it was right around version 1.0. Ruby on Rails was just getting started, and there was these communities popping up in different places. And that's how I sort of made my first real internet friends, was really talking about Ruby and Ruby on Rails, and how exciting that is compared to some of those other technologies that were available at the time. And that's kind of how I got my connection to Germany a little bit, because the startups there started to use Ruby. And at that time, someone who had even a 6 months of experience with Ruby on Rails was like an experienced Ruby developer, right? So
Instant hire, yeah.
exactly. So I was still in high school when I got first hired, and that's kind of like and started working on all of these projects. And I think at that time it was kind of inevitable that I would end up somewhere else.
Yeah.
So I
Have
went
you
to
have you met DHH at some point? Have you met David
um I
at a
think,
Rails conf
yeah,
or
probably
somewhere?
at a conference. I don't recall having a lot of kind of interactions with him, but I think I did. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Rails fully like past me. I've never used it, or I've
Right.
never really tried it. But no, it's actually true. I've heard of quite a bunch of Berlin companies, especially a few years ago, that were really deep on Rails. And I think even our university used Rails, Ruby on Rails, for most of their IT infrastructure to run these courses. And yeah, it's you said one very interesting point is that you make so many new friends over a specific community. For me, it was more like the gaming community and the
Right.
multiplayer games, and I was fluent in English before I had English in class, like in higher English in class, because
Right.
you need to. There's no German only servers. It's primarily English is the language of the web. Um, and I think it's great. I think it's amazing that these communities give you a home, and you can find these communities everywhere in the world. You can find a Rails engineer probably in most big cities, or not only Rails but engineers in general. And it's great that they give you a feeling of home wherever you are, in which city you are, and that's just amazing, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I think having something like in common that you're passionate about, and you can discuss and kind of, exchange opinions on, have discussions. I think that really creates like really lifelong friendships a lot of the time.
Yeah.
At least that's from my experience.
Yeah. And tell me more about your entrepreneurial career before Pilot. We will talk about Pilot very soon, but um, how was like traveling across different countries? How did that impact your entrepreneurial career? You landed in San Francisco, but have you started Pilot there? Was that the
Right.
reason to go to San Francisco to start Pilot, or what were you doing before?
Yeah. So I think I got my entrepreneurial bug probably right around the time when I started working with different startups in Germany and mostly Berlin, and kind of like realized that, hey, these are just like regular people starting companies, and that's possible now, right? You can
Right.
you can get that done. So I um, ended up moving to the UK to do computer science at Cambridge,
Hmm.
and And right after college, actually no, I was still in college. It was my second year, I think, that I decided to start a company. um, Something that the university is not particularly fond of. Actually, it's a very interesting difference. Like in Stanford, or I think across America, like you have this concept of like starting companies in university, incubating them at university, and universities generally try to promote
Yeah.
that. I
Yeah.
got in trouble for starting a company in college. My dean just called me in, and they were like, you can't work, like even if it's your own company, that's not
It's
allowed.
crazy. Yeah.
So I had to do it on the down low. But that's kind of how I got into this, and I think Pilot is my fourth probably attempt. All of the previous ones were bootstrapped. We've always like made money off the first one to fund the second one, and I think since the second one, I've had the same co-founder on a lot of those businesses, on all of
Awesome.
those businesses. So, and a lot of the same employees actually. Like we ended up like there's some people on my current team that I've worked with for a decade now,
Wow. Yeah.
which is really great, right? So that's kind of how I got started. Most of so Pilot, we started when I was still living in London, and I was trying to help, because initially Pilot we were doing something a little bit different than what we do today,
Ooh,
as
interesting.
with many startups,
Most
right?
companies, yeah.
So yeah, so
Was that
we
the
started.
was that the same name? Sorry.
It was the same name, yeah.
Okay.
It was kind of it was a soft pivot that we ended up doing. So we initially were building a marketplace for online engineering talent mostly, right? And I started that because I had all of these friends in different countries that were great engineers, but didn't have access to the same
Right.
opportunities that I did,
Right.
even before I moved to the Bay Area. But, being in London and knowing all of these companies and having worked with a bunch of startups in Germany, having a bit of a reputation there, it opened a lot of doors for me, which my friends didn't have access to, right? And a lot of the time they're better engineers than I was. So I kind of always felt like that was really unfair, right? That your opportunities in life are so predicated, or when you happen to be like, where do you happen to
Yeah.
live, where were you
Yeah.
born, like what language do you speak, what accent do you have, like there's just so many things that have a significant impact on your life, that have nothing to do with your skill level and how great of an employee you're going to be, right? So that's kind of why, that's why I started Pilot, is to really try to even out that playing field, create a more open worldwide job market, and have the world be a more open place, right? Because, and I'm sure you can sympathize with that, coming from Europe and probably benefiting personally from the freedom of movement and all of the great stuff with the European Union. It feels like a right that everyone should
Yeah.
have.
Yeah.
That's very much not the case around the world, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's
So
true.
that's how we got started. The story of our pivot is that we ended up, so we grew that company. It was going pretty well. We were signing a bunch of like really large enterprise deals. Like the largest contract I've signed was it was like $1 million annual revenue type of contract, right?
Hmm.
So I kind of cut my teeth on doing enterprise sales and things like that, but ultimately the product wasn't growing as quickly as we would have liked it to. And at the same time, all of our customers were telling us like how much they love the experience of hiring and paying people through Pilot.
Right.
And they were like, can I use this with my own team? Like, why do I have to hire people from your network? Like, just let me do my own recruiting. I have my own team. Just give me the tools to make the payment experience and the
Yeah.
hiring experience much better, right? So that's when we realized that maybe there was a more interesting product that we could be building, and we took all of that infrastructure that we had, all of the software, we kind of refocused it to be more just payroll benefits and compliance for remote teams.
Yeah. That's an amazing story, and that's usually how most of these companies evolve over time. You start with, and the vision is still the same. It's like connecting and opening up the job market for underrepresented
Exactly.
entrepreneurs and tech workers. But you keep that focus on this mission, and but you change your direction along the way, and it just makes total sense to go now into payrolling. So for those who don't know, so Pilot is basically doing payroll for global remote companies.
Right.
And the way you do that, if I understand correctly, is you hire these people in the specific country, and they work for the other company, so they don't need to set up a subsidiary. Is that correct?
That's right. We do both. So the majority of folks in our network, on our product, are hired as contractors,
Right.
just because, and I think we'll get to that. That in many cases is the better model,
Yeah.
right? But ultimately, as you scale your company, you really need that flexibility to be able to offer full employment to maybe a selection of your hires, maybe all of your hires. Like we see some
Yes.
companies that have 100% of the team members on pilot being actual employees. And then we have other companies where none of the folks are employees and everyone is a contractor,
Not
right?
even the founder.
And
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
exactly, right? And like one of the key sort of insights for us is that we wanted to build a platform that enables true global employment, right?
Yeah.
And that makes it incredibly easy, kind of like, you know, you have Gusto in the US where it's relatively easy to be able to hire someone, except when you start crossing state lines, it becomes a little bit more complicated. Um, but it's like it's relatively easy. There's good tools for that, right? As soon as you start thinking, oh, I want to hire outside of the US, it becomes this incredibly complicated mess of compliance, legal, contracts, worker classification risk, IP risk, and even just like moving money. Like you'd think that that's like a solved
It's a
problem,
pain.
right?
It's a pain. Yeah. I mean, having a US and a European and a German company, it's a pain. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't
So
be.
yeah, yeah, exactly. There's no good reason for it, except politics, you know. And we can we probably shouldn't talk about that. But yeah, so that's kind of we felt like the product that does that well internationally really needs to support both employees and contractors because our focus has always been on full-time team members. We don't have any even support in our product for like, let's do a 3-month contract with this milestone and that milestone. That has never been, even when we're doing the marketplace, we always were matching companies with effectively full-time
Yeah.
workers. So that
Yeah.
has still, you know, stayed the same.
Yeah. And I think for all early stage companies, there's like this weird dynamic where you want to have people commit full time, but you might be too early uh, to make the call on the same day. And I think, and now I need to talk about what I'm working on. So Lean Hire is basically trying to get there, to make it easier for you to hire someone on a contract basis very early on. As you said, on a 2 months, 3 months base of project, but always having the goal to get them on for a full-time role. But again, there's companies that just raise a angel round, pre-seed round, something, and they don't really they can't put up a full years of salary to commit. So I
Right.
think the lean hire approach combined with pilot is just an amazing way to start a new company by essentially de-risking your team members, both their scope. Like, you don't want to join a company that has like less than 12 months of runway. So
Right.
having a job offer from an early stage pre-seed company in full time sounds kind of sketchy because you never really know how long this will be a full-time position. But then having the way to change, and I guess it's very easy on pilot to start as a contract and then convert that guy into, or person into a
Exactly.
full-time
Yeah.
position. So that's just amazing to hear, because that was not the case when I got started 4 years ago. Just 4 years ago, it sounds very short, but the whole remote workplace has changed so quickly, obviously because we're all going through a pandemic. But I remember, and I bring this up almost every podcast, that there is some investors that just don't want to be part of your round if you're not based in San Francisco. And
Right.
that's something where I still think, wow, this is just insanity. I mean, looking at all the companies that are being built remotely right now and it's working, it's just mind blowing. So kudos to you. Helping entrepreneurs hire globally, it's very close to my heart because it brings money, and that's what people don't get. It brings money to underrepresented communities. We don't need
Right.
more what do I say, like 200,000 salaries in San Francisco when everything's crashing and the housing market is basically exploding, when we have the same talent at half the price in Germany, Poland, Ukraine. And it's just great to see that it's getting easier. I think also the culture is opening up.
Yeah.
If I'm right, so you must be working with a bunch of not YC companies, a bunch of startups that maybe have only had engineers in house, and now they're opening up. So what's like a typical story for companies that use Pilot?
Yeah. So it really depends. Like there's a couple of companies that have always been remote and just need better infrastructure to manage that entire process because they had a bunch of, like things glued together, put together with duct tape and a bunch of homegrown solutions that they've used. And the other, which I'm really excited for, is really the companies that are just making their first steps into hiring internationally, because that's where I feel like we can have real impact of having, like it's going to be like if you have the right tools, if you didn't have the right tools, you might not make that hire, right? And I think that really speaks to sort of our mission in trying to create this more open worldwide job market. Is, and if we can help companies hire more across borders by giving them better tools to do it, um, that's extremely exciting to me. And we end up spending a lot of time helping other companies kind of think through those decisions, even if they don't end up becoming customers of ours. Like, I'm still happy as long as we can have more companies that are willing to go outside of their backyard for their hiring and kind of, be a little bit more open, right?
Yeah.
So I think, the two typical stories is, like what we're seeing more and more today is like companies that have just realized that, hey, remote actually works really well. Right? Like, we've been on this forced trial effectively of remote. Everyone is, right? And
It's a good
like,
metaphor.
yeah, and then you start thinking, so companies, when they go remote, they kind of go at it in stages. Like, the first step is really like, we allow work from home, right? That's kind of like phase one. Um, and once you allow for that with kind of occasional office access, you start then being more flexible and saying, well, this person can't come into the office once a week because they happen to live in a different city, right? But they're great. We want to have them be on the team, and most of the time we're working remotely anyway, so it's not an issue, right? And then you expand to a different city, and then you hire someone in a different state, right? And that's where you hit the sort of the first hurdle, the logistical hurdle, because the initial hurdles are really communication based, right? And we're all solving those problems collectively right now. There's great tools. There's like companies are getting used to being on Slack and Zoom and all of those different platforms,
And
right?
amazing time zone tools as well to know
Exactly.
who's in
Yeah.
which time zone, and yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So the first like logistical hurdle you hit is when you make your first hire in another state, right? Because then you have to start thinking about, oh, what are the state registrations? Like, what are the filings that I have to do? Do I have to do this like foreign incorporation thing or not? How do I manage payroll? Like, how do I deal with benefits, right? So like health insurance is not easy, even in the US
Oh
for
my
remote
God, yeah.
companies, right? A lot of insurers will tell you like, if you don't have more than 50% of your employees in a single state, they won't be able to support you, right? And what do you do then? So, so that's kind of how it happens. And then once you're already kind of spread out across the U.S., if you have the right tools, it's really hard to find good arguments for why you shouldn't hire this person who just happens to be in Bogota, Colombia, right? Like, time zones are similar. You're already dealing with time zones if you have folks in San Francisco and New York, right?
Right.
And like, why not? Like, they're a great engineer or customer success person, whatever the role is. Why wouldn't I hire them? So a lot of the companies that kind of like put in their job descriptions that is like remote but US only, quite rightfully get shamed for it,
Yeah.
because it's like what does that mean? Like, why am I a worse candidate just because I'm like 100 miles south of your border? It's like,
Exactly. Yeah.
it's insane, right? So I think it's a natural progression, right? You start hiring in South America, maybe in Mexico, and then you're like, well, but I have this great candidate in Europe, and time zones are a little bit more difficult, but they're really great. And then over time you start benefiting from a lot of those things. Like, well, now we've suddenly have like 24/7 support, and we can like hand off from, you know, one team member to another and effectively have this like continuous
Yeah.
delivery model,
Yeah.
which just wouldn't be possible with your team just being in San Francisco, right? So
Exactly.
it's kind of like once you make that first step, a lot of the subsequent steps are kind of inevitable, at least from my experience.
I think that's a super valid point to make, to just show teams that, yeah, if you need 24/7 customer support, if you need 24/7 uptime support for a very back-end heavy
Right.
product, you can't do that. In like, you will need people to be off hours, like night shifts, and
Yeah.
that's not a healthy, usually not a healthy work culture. So it's much healthier to split that up. But the second thing that most people don't get for remote hiring is, by default, you will build a global company. You will not build a localized product that only works for a very small amount of companies in Silicon Valley. You will get input from, let's say, the German engineer, and he has its eyes open. He's looking around, and he
Yeah.
might find a customer in Berlin that will now use your product, right? Like, the
Right.
biggest evangelists are your own employees. So the moment you start hiring globally, you will have all these spies, essentially, not spies,
Yeah.
but like all these angels flying around,
Yeah.
promoting your product. And you might sign up customers who you would have never met before, or you might find the next hire who you might have never seen before. And I think Stripe is an amazing example. Stripe needs to be global because their customers are global. And
Right.
if you're building a tech company and you say, I only want to sell to San Francisco companies, that's usually a good market, but not a big market. And
Yeah.
if you can start from scratch and you don't do like a lot of logistics and a lot of moving parts, you can sell to someone in Zimbabwe by the first day, and
Yeah.
you could hire someone next door. And I think that's just it's such a huge benefit that so many entrepreneurs don't, or maybe start to realize now. And some of them might even wish to have a distributed team from the get-go, because now their competitors are basically ramping up globally, and it's
Yeah.
so much harder to move a whole team from one position to the other. And it's also
Right.
really, really hard to have a centralized team and then sort of like add these remote beacons
Yeah.
later on.
Yeah.
Um,
It's much harder to do it that way.
it's much
And
harder.
it's kind of it's kind of interesting because if you think about it, if you have your eyes set on becoming a billion or $100 billion company, right? There are ways to do that by being just focused on the US, right? But that's, I feel like those businesses are like, there is obviously more $100 billion companies that can be created if your market is the world, right, as opposed to just America, right?
Right.
So you just have a hugely like much bigger market to tackle, right? So companies eventually, if you're on that path of becoming $100 billion company, eventually you become global anyway. Like there's it's kind of
Exactly.
it's almost
It's
it almost just
inevitable. Yeah.
happens, right? Exactly, right? So like, but then if you do it too late, like as you've pointed out, it's much harder to do it, right? Because your culture and your processes are already ingrained in a world where everyone might be in the same like large office building in San
Yes.
Francisco,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And then you have to like do this like really complicated, really risky thing of turning yourselves into a global company
Yeah.
where you're much less nimble and much less adaptable. There's a lot more that's already ingrained in the culture and your processes that you can't easily change. So that change becomes much more difficult. So the way to think about like starting as remote is you really like you're really just front loading the work that you would probably eventually have to do anyway, right? But you do it when it's easier, when your organization is much more pliable, when
Yeah.
you still have those when the decisions to do things one way versus the other are still easy to make, right?
Yeah.
So I think a lot of remote teams have huge advantages for scaling, because for them it's more of a linear process, right? If you're remote, you can kind of grow your headcount internationally and grow your global presence in a very linear fashion, right? Or exponent, depending how quickly you're growing, right? But what I'm saying is, it's not a step function, right? Whereas if you are following the more traditional route, it's like San Francisco, opening a London office, right? And
Whoa.
then opening a Germany or a Berlin office,
Yeah,
right? And it's
yeah,
like, you don't have to do it that way.
yeah,
You
yeah,
can, you can have it grow much more smoothly in line with your
yeah,
revenue and,
yeah.
usage numbers and or other KPIs.
Yeah, no, I fully agree, and it's something where I would imagine a lot of companies even endangered their core market when they have been so well comfortable in their local market, and they always treat it like an uh, additional market. Like, oh yeah,
Right.
we're selling to San Francisco companies, but occasionally there's someone in Berlin who's like using our platform. But
Right.
because you only have a single person maybe in Berlin who is doing like customer acquisition or customer service, but the moment you start from the get-go, you don't have a core market. Like the core market is the world. The core market is anyone who has a laptop and an internet connection. And I
Right.
think that's also keeping some entrepreneurs back to go outside of their comfort zone, outside their comfort region. So hiring is so important for companies that it sets the stage. It's just
Yeah.
how you hire, and who you hire is who you will be with, and I think, yeah, that will definitely change. I there's a lot of conspiracy, well, not conspiracies, but a lot of that's also a lot of conspiracies going around the
Right.
pandemic. But there's a lot of questions being asked how the future of work will look like, but by no chance this will be like going back. I just don't see it. And that's speaking from Germany. So I'm in Germany right now. We have contained the virus. I'm joking.
Right.
Like Donald Trump said, we have contained. No, we seriously have contained the virus. It's everything's reopened. Not everything, but it's going back to normal. But still, people prefer to work from home. People prefer to work
Yeah.
remotely, and we had an office in our previous company, and we had a whiteboard sessions, and we had stand-up meetings, and slowly one of our engineers, he married and got a baby, and he moved to a different city. So that's where it was like, yeah, we can't force you to stay in this city. Like,
Right.
that would be absurd to ask that. And I was thinking of how many employers would literally say, yeah, but we need you here, right? and
Yeah.
and and it was just mind blowing that so many uh in so many companies this will definitely happen.
Yeah.
And that was the moment, like it was such an easy decision to say, yeah, sure, we can do remote, because it
Right.
was still very early. We were like seven employees at that time. And then the next person said, well, by the way, I want to do more. I want to do part-time studies. I might not be able, if I need to go to the office, I would lose like an hour per day. I want to spend that on my university. Can I work from home? And I was like, yeah, of course. And that was before COVID. And now it's just inevitable, and it's just obvious that it's
Yeah.
I would still be cautious about saying it's better, but it's definitely not worse. There's pros and cons. I love whiteboards, but I also love working on my own time. I also like
Yeah.
working on night shifts when I couldn't in the office. So it's definitely very interesting how the whole workspace is changing.
Yeah. I would by no means say that like I'm bullish on remote, obviously, and I think it's there to stay with us. But I'm not the type of person who thinks that every company should be remote and all of your employees should be widely distributed. I think it really depends on the business that you're running, the stage at which you are, and kind of what you're building, and there's just a lot of factors in there. And I think it's what I think will happen is that it has become an acceptable way to run a company, kind of on par with having everyone in the same office, right?
Yeah,
And I think that's already a huge win, right?
that's amazing. I mean, yeah.
Right, because previously it wasn't the question of like what model works best for your company. It was the question of, oh, I'm a VC, you have to have everyone in San Francisco, right? Or I'm not going to give you money, right?
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
that has been, completely debunked at this point, where, like, if it makes more sense for your business to do it that way, amazing, let's do it, right? But if you're a hardware startup, like nobody's going to say that like it's going to be easier for you to be remote, right? I don't
Yeah.
think I would try to convince Apple to try to go full remote, right? Because that wouldn't work for them, right? It's just not the type of business that they have. But at
Or
the same time, I
Tesla.
think,
Go for Tesla.
right, exactly, yeah. But I think what has really changed is that at least for a while, companies won't have a very good reason to say no, right? Because when you have employees that have been forced to work remotely and now they have to come back, right? You as a company are taking on a huge risk if you require that employee to come back to work, right? Because if your employees are not feeling comfortable because they feel you're putting them at risk,
Yeah.
like even just like talk to your lawyers about the potential liability that you're opening yourself up to by requiring
Jeez.
everyone to come into work, right?
Yeah.
Whereas previously it was like if someone was requesting to work from home, it was like, oh, they're being particular, they probably want to slack off and work from their pajamas and whatnot, right? Right now the argument is like they're probably scared to come into work, and if I force them to do it, I can get in trouble, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's just not so. I think a lot of the kind of like the reasons are different, right? And I think that matters for companies. I think a lot of them will just, not only because they've tested it and it works out well for them, but also because they'll be afraid to say no, just purely based on the risk and making their employees just be uncomfortable, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, man, I looking back, it's one of these moments where you look back and you just realize like, holy shit, we've done a lot of stuff so super hyper inefficient. And
Right.
I think when I was learning on the web before I learned in, like, I obviously everyone is self-taught in computer science. At some point you don't pick up the skills you need in a usually not in a university. So you learn everything on the web already. You do all these code academies and tutorials and read the documentations by yourself. And then you're required to be local with a team, to sit in a bus or sit in a train. I was traveling like sometimes 2 hours per day from Menlo Park to San Francisco. And you just start to realize like, why? Like, I was born on the web. Why do I need to physically move
Yeah.
when we could like open Zoom and have a conversation about the code base and do the deployment? Um, and I think it's so weird to have Silicon Valley in the cloud from a mindset, like sell everywhere, but be
Yeah.
in one, like that
It's
alone
really strange.
amazes
Yeah.
me. It's so strange.
I
And
used
I'm
to
glad I'm glad this is unbundling. Yeah, it's very wild.
yeah. I used to work for a company in London when I was still living in Cambridge, and it's like a 50-minute train ride plus maybe like a half an hour on the tube to get to their office, and the tasks that the engineering team had on their list for this week, they were literally on a physical whiteboard. There was no digital copy anywhere, and it's like, like the cleaner could just come in and accidentally throw it all away,
Destroy
and
the
you would have
roadmap.
no
Yeah.
idea. You would have no idea what you had on your roadmap for the week, right? And it's like everything, as you said, like everything is in the cloud, and yet like a lot of these processes are so offline for no good reason, right? I mean, there are some cases where the experience of being in front of a whiteboard and collaborating with your team, that's still very hard to recreate online. There are tools that are trying to make that better, and I think eventually we'll get there. Maybe it will take VR to get us to that stage. I don't know, right? But like,
I saw some teams joining in a third person player, like multiplayer, just to
yeah,
be like
yeah.
handing stuff. So yeah, it's very interesting. It wasn't
I've seen
VR, but it was definitely interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen and this is really interesting. I think I've read a story of a teacher giving like a maths lecture in Half-Life Alex in the VR game, because you can like write with your hands, and it's kind of like a whiteboard.
That's
You can just write
so
on walls
cool.
and stuff, and I
That's
was
so
like, oh
cool.
wow.
That's so
Yeah,
cool.
so
Yeah,
yeah, I
I was
think
I was
I think
I was
eventually we'll get good
interrupting you.
tools.
Yeah, I was interrupting you. We were talking about how the inefficiency, you were in London, and then
No, I was just saying how, like, I was just reiterating your point with everything being in the cloud and all these tools
yeah,
that we're building. Like, there's this disconnect between, we're building this like digital future, but ourselves, like, a lot of companies are living in this analog past. Like, everyone is in the same office and commuting and kind of dealing with all of those issues, to come in and build digital tools that let you not do that. I
yeah,
think, like, Slack was a great example of that. And this is not to poo-poo on Slack. They're a great company, but until very recently, they weren't remote, right?
yeah,
And it's like one of the best tools for teams to collaborate across time zones and while staying at home. And at the same time, it was built by people coming into mostly the same office, right? And it's just kind of it's kind of remarkable that we can kind of live in this world where we're building the tools, but ourselves, we're kind of not really taking fully advantage of them a lot of the time.
yeah, yeah.
It's really interesting.
It's the big tech hypocrisy. And to be fair, it's good to not poop on Slack because they never really started out to be a remote tool. That's
Right.
something people don't understand. Like it used to be a chat client for Teams.
Yeah.
You can use that remotely. You can use that in house. We used it in our company in house, and because it was just easier and faster to communicate and not like step up
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
go to
Yeah.
the other room and have a conversation. But once you're like 2 weeks in using Slack or any other client or any other messenger, and you sit in the same office, but you don't even talk. Like
Right.
we had an office with 3 people in the same room, and they were not talking. They were just like slacking, like sitting
Right.
next to, because you can copy paste stuff and you can send pictures and you send files. And any manager looking at that should be, why do we pay a lease? Like, talk,
Right.
right? So
Yeah.
I think Slack by accident became a remote tool, and the only reason why you still can poop on Slack, it's not really good for remote teams, to be fair. It's good for like small teams, for like 3 to 4 to 5. But once you have different time zones, once you have maybe you want to do a little bit more with audio, um, that will
It's
be a
not good on its
challenge.
own.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not good on its
Yes.
own. I think teams very quickly realize, and especially when you start dealing with time zones, asynchronous communication becomes a lot more important than synchronous. And
Yeah.
Slack, whilst you can do it in there, is not really particularly good for it. So we also use a combination of other tools, including Threads, which I personally really like,
Oh yeah, yeah.
for
We use that as well.
these kind of like more long form discussions that, like, really, like, Slack is very ephemeral, right? Even though they kind of claim that it can become this brain for your company and it has search and everything is searchable, it is more searchable than email, that it's stuck in like individual team members mailboxes, right? So
Yeah.
it is
Yeah.
an improvement, that's for sure. But I don't think I've met a single team that would say like, oh yeah, I can easily find things in Slack. Like,
That's like the biggest lie in tech. Yeah. Oh yeah, let me just
yeah,
find that on Slack. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Especially
it just
since
doesn't
probably
happen.
most teams don't even buy the pro version of Slack. So, oh, I guess my brain is like, yeah, I lost that information. It's gone.
Which it's actually, so this is interesting. I've heard that, I can't remember if it was the folks at GitLab or Envision that intentionally don't pay for Slack because of the message expiring. So
Oh
they basically
yeah.
said, we don't want messages to be searchable because we want to force people to
To
have to take
use,
this knowledge out
yes.
of Slack
Yeah.
and put it in wikis and other tools, etc. So
Wow.
it's kind of interesting how,
Wow.
like,
That's an
so,
interesting dynamic.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
And it
That
makes
kind of blew
sense.
my
We
blew
also
my
did
mind when I.
we also didn't do that. Like we never paid for Slack because we had the same mantra as well. Like, hey, if you want to save something, we use Basecamp at the last
Right.
few months, because it just had everything, the drill, like all-in-one tools for something. But and we said, yeah, everything that's like corporate knowledge, like don't discuss that in Slack. Slack is fine for like, hey, do you want to meet up for pair programming? Hey, like even water cooler chatter or some other like
Right.
low quality, not low quality, but low risk information type of exchange.
Well, ephemeral. I think like
Yeah,
ephemeral information. Yeah.
yeah. But then everything else should be like, yeah, put it in Notion, put it in Basecamp, put it in whatever you prefer, Threads, any different platform
Yeah.
that. Carrot is also very cool. It's more like a wiki-ish type of
Oh, interesting. I don't
interface.
think I've heard about it.
And I think, and that's the last thing I think most people switching to remote need to learn, and it's probably something that almost all podcasts about remote talk about, is learn to write, like
Right.
a coherent, long. I mean, it doesn't need to be long, but just coherent letter type of
Yeah.
information, not this, hey, are you up? Want to fix something? Like
Right.
this instant notification of instant storm of notifications coming on your phone. That's really bad. I was waking up in San Francisco with 8 hours of time zone difference. My team was working in Germany, and I was waking up to like 100 notifications from Slack. And
Right.
you could really, like, literally summarize everything in one big like letter, and send me,
Yeah.
if you're really not like good setup on tools, you just send me a Google Docs link. But if you're into Threads and into Carrot and into Basecamp, please just send me a document, like just
Right.
put in an image, like, this is what I've learned, I'm stuck here, we need to do this for that. And it's fine to not like watch out for spelling. It just needs to make sense.
Yeah.
And that's something a lot of more folks need to learn. Listen, it's much worse than documenting your code. It's much worse than you keeping up with issues in your GitHub, but it's your core communication at some point. So you need to learn
Yeah.
it, and you need to be continuing to learn on that. And there's a great reference everywhere and great resources. It will be a difference between hiring you and firing you. If you're
Yeah.
really good on communicating and keeping track of everything, that's 10x. That will 10x your position for sure. So yeah.
It's kind of funny because it's like it's an etiquette that that we sort of lost when communicating with people, where the IM has kind of taught us that, you know, you can just short circuit from what's in your brain onto words and just like spit it out, you know, and kind of ramble and
Yeah.
just get it out there, right? But what that does effectively, it pushes the responsibility for thinking onto the recipient, right?
Right.
And that just doesn't really scale because you only have one sender of that message, right? But you have multiple recipients. So if you're not putting in that work to like really craft your thoughts and structure them in a way that are easily digestible, you've just wasted potentially 10 or, you know, hundreds of other people's time who now have to read through your messages and try to parse out what you actually mean, right? And like,
And who is
and
it
it's just
for, right? Yeah.
exactly right. So it's just like it's extremely wasteful. And I think the same applies to things like meetings, right? Where, and I think the folks at Basecamp have been on that bandwagon for a very long time, that like if you have a 10-person meeting, you know, and it lasts an hour, that's 10 hours, you know, that you've
Yeah.
just taken
Yeah.
from the company, right? And
Yeah.
was it really worth it? You know, like, could it have been done in 15 minutes with just 3 people, right? And like,
Just
think
just
about the,
in one letter. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Like, think about the cost that the hidden cost that you're
Yeah.
not thinking about when calling a large meeting, right? So
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, it's very cool to you have this forcing function to eliminate meetings when it's just impossible to run meetings at some point.
right.
Having it the same overlapping time zone for, let's say, Germany and San Francisco is maybe like 1 or 2 hours per day, to be fair, if you don't want to
Yeah.
work into late night hours. And so if I wake up at 8 or 9 a.m., I don't want to be in a 1 hour meeting to start off the day.
Right.
So while there is a chance to meet everyone on the same team at the same time, half of the team would be like, Oh, let me sleep. So
I start
that's not how you want to do a Zoom call, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah.
get over it.
I start my first meeting at 6:30 a.m. every day. That's my that's my
It's your
usual
face.
starting point.
Okay.
Yeah, and so but as you've pointed out, like all of my meetings with the team are pretty much between 7 a.m. and 9 a.m. And that means that after 9, I'm done with my all of the internal meetings
Yeah,
and a lot of the internal communication as well, because our team is pretty spread out, which means that I can focus on actual work. I whether that's talking to customers or writing code or doing whatever, right? But like I'm not but this forcing function is actually extremely helpful, and I
yeah,
think teams that are not widely distributed um, kind of lose that. Like if you're remote but you're in the same country or like the same time zone,
same
right,
time zone.
roughly,
Yeah,
right, you end up defaulting to this like very heavy synchronous communication and work mode, which that's not the most productive state for a remote company to be in, right?
yeah,
Because at that point you kind of like, yes, you gain a little bit by not having folks have a commute, but at the same time you've really just moved the chatter and all of that stuff from one medium to the other, and you haven't created any new space for like deep creative work, right?
yeah.
Whereas I think if you can kind of let go a little bit, and some companies do those like no meaning Thursdays, whatever that is for your company, right? We should do, and I think Jason Fried and the folks at Basecamp are pitching that as well. You should do like no chat Wednesdays as well, like but get people off Slack and not like constantly chatting to each other, because that's not being productive. That's just busy work.
Yeah, yeah. No, I
Yeah.
feel you. And we banned Slack at some point. We had 8 employees, and we straight up banned Slack because we noticed that it was just not a real value add. Like the knowledge and the strategy and the direction of the company was already done in Basecamp, and Basecamp has its fireside chat, but it's not really. Well, it's ugly, and it's probably
Right.
ugly by choice that you don't really want to hang in
Right.
there for too long. Um, and yeah, it can definitely make a change. And I see some people say, well, but I want to build up meaningful relationships with my colleagues. That's something that would be different in the future. I don't know whether this is good or bad, but I think a remote company by default will have less, I'd quote unquote, meaningful human interaction with your peers. Just by default,
Right.
you will have these conversations, and you will enjoy these conversations over Zoom, but it's just a difference bumping into someone and playing like half an hour of ping pong. um,
So
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 yeah.
the one thing that I would say to challenge that is that if I look at if I look at my life and I think about the meaningful interactions that I've had with people, um, a lot of the time that didn't come out of like physical proximity, right? um they feel more real in many ways when they're happening, right? But think about like all of your high school friends that like you've you've spent all of this time together, like you've had all of these like physical interactions with, right?
Yeah,
And like for me personally, like I hardly ever talk to them anymore, right?
yeah, it's true.
Whereas some of the people that I've met online and we really bonded over like Ruby on Rails or some of those other like kind of more meaningful things, I didn't meet them that often. Like I would maybe meet up with them once every couple of months, but like we had this like shared passion and mission and we had a reason to meet. um,
Hmm.
that felt that created much more longer lasting and stronger bonds in the end,
Yeah,
even though they maybe didn't feel like it at the time, right? So
yeah,
i'm
yeah.
i'm kind of I'm trying to play the devil's advocate here and think about like, are those relationships where you just play ping pong really meaningful, like or is it just superficially meaningful? It feels that way, but in reality you can create much stronger bonds with people by collaborating on something effectively and having a sort of a shared sense of accomplishment that that can transcend the sort of the physical, right? Whereas,
Right.
just playing ping pong with someone doesn't necessarily make them, your best friend, or a great colleague, right? It's just like,
Exactly.
yeah. So I'm very curious how it's going to shake out. I think the in-person component is important. Um, I just don't know if like actually physically being there every day does contribute as significantly to building those relationships as you might think. We've at Pilot, we've for a very long time we've had this. Um, we get everyone together within the company on a 4-month cycle, right? So every 4 months we would get the entire company together for like between 2 days and a week
Right.
to basically work together, meet, go out to dinner. And I feel like because those experiences are curated and they're choreographed in some ways, we have like team members that plan those events and make sure that we're having fun, and
Right.
that we have kind of good conversations and discussions done. um, I feel like that in some ways created a lot more kind of like real sense of
And
of
commitment.
of, of
Yeah.
bonding with the
Yeah.
team and
Yeah.
commitment
Yeah.
than just, oh, we're in the same office and we go out and get lunch every day.
Forced
my,
by
my, my
yeah.
co-founder and I, we've never been in the same place for more than 3 months at a time, like.
Yeah.
And I've worked with him for over 10 years now, right?
Yeah.
And that was entirely built on working remotely.
Yeah. And again, the reason why I was bringing up this topic is I think the perfect solution that most people don't see right now, because a lot of them have been locked up in just working 8 hours, 9 hours per day, and cutting down on their social life, friends, family, hobbies. I saw a tweet from, who was that? He's also a huge advocate for remote work. I think it's the founder of First Base. What was his name on Twitter? And essentially saying remote work is the renaissance of meeting friends and hobbies. And
Right.
there is a big, I don't know when that was. It was pre-COVID, where there was a study about remote workers that they felt lonely and that didn't build up these let's say connections with their colleagues. Basically the stuff that I led the story with, the discussion with. But what people now realize is remote work doesn't mean you're like lonely in your own home. It will free you up to meet more friends, to even meet others who are also remote. I think that
Right.
study, it was in 2000 something, 2014, 15 something. You might be the only remote person in the whole city at some point, maybe, or not in the city, it
Right.
depends on your city, but in your close approximation. So when now everyone's remote, like you'll be making friends with someone else who's also remote, and have like these cross company connections.
Right.
And I've seen companies building safe spaces now in Germany, like these tiny co-working spaces. It's just one room or two rooms, like not these WeWork
Right.
gigantic
Right. Right.
stuffs. And that's where you meet, essentially, if you want to have, well, these work friend relationships, you will build that, but with different people, with others who are also working on, maybe they're also entrepreneurs, maybe they're
Yeah.
also employed at maybe even at the same company. And I think that's the way how this will be solved. That, hey, if you feel lonely, you will work from, as you said, 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., and then you meet your friends. Like
Right.
that's where you meet your friends. You hang out with your fiance or your partner, with your baby. You cut down all that commuting and
Yeah.
being forced in the office longer than you should, because the office is so fancy. Like we all know the ping pong tables, the free drinks and free food, trying to keep you in the office. Um, yeah, that will change. I don't see that coming back.
Yeah. And I think this is just anecdotal and definitely doesn't apply to everyone, but I did hear from people that said that they actually see their friends more now because of the pandemic, because it's like we're just all on Zoom and FaceTime and all of these other tools, right? Where previously it would take forever for people to organize an outing and actually get together with friends. And from a lot of people I've heard like, oh, now I speak to my friends like every day or every weekend. We hang out and like do stuff together. And granted, it's not the same, and it's not breaking bread together, going to a
Yeah,
restaurant, going to see a film or whatever. So like, I'm not saying it's better, right? Like I want to be very explicit about that, but like it's different, and it's but it's still connecting with people, right?
yeah,
Like you can do that remotely. I
yeah,
don't think the physical component is important, but as you said, there are sort of other ways to kind of meet and build those relationships, even if the people that you work with are not your kind of immediate friend sort of social group. And for many people that's actually better, like you get a more diverse set of friends if
yeah.
like so I work out of a co-working space in San Francisco, and obviously right now there's like basically nobody in the building. I have a private office here, but like when I was here, like I enjoy talking to other people at the co-working space because they do different things than like that my employees do and my
Yeah,
team does, right? Like there's only so much variety you can have within a company that is so focused on a specific mission, right? And then you talk to someone else who's doing like very interesting stuff with in a completely different space and comes from a completely different background, a person that like probably wouldn't want to necessarily work at our company just because of what we're
exactly.
doing, right?
Yeah,
But I can still have a meaningful conversation with them, and I can talk to them and kind of exchange experiences, and that probably wouldn't happen if all I did was socialize with my coworkers, right? So
right. Yeah,
yeah,
it's you have a much broad, if you want to, you can have a much broader um range of friends or interesting people to talk to, and you can engage in I've seen a bunch of remote recurring Zoom meetings popping up where people talk about
right,
their remote experience. um they would never fire before. Like I would say Meetup is the closest thing to have like in a physical space, but having these virtual meetings pop up and you can do, I don't know, Zoom yoga and then Zoom
right,
cooking. And yeah, I think the number one thing I love about this, and hopefully it will stay when people are remote even after the pandemic, is you can just call people if you're not in a
yeah,
podcast right now, or
right,
in a meeting or in a business meeting, or you're traveling to another place. um, there's basically no reason to not pick up because you will be at home most likely.
right,
um,
right,
so I think normalizing, which sounds so weird, but normalizing randomly calling someone, that's great. I,
yeah,
I really like it. I really love having like getting a call from someone if I have time, and I also like calling people by just by random times. Um, that's something that was even rude at some point. Like
yeah,
it could be
yeah,
rude to call someone when you know he's in the office. Like, hey, why do you call me? I'm at work. Like I can't speak.
yeah, yeah,
So that has changed. And if someone calls me today and I spend 15 minutes on the call, like that's fine. I would just either work 15 minutes more today or not, or
yeah,
work 15 minutes more tomorrow, or I don't even care, right? Because you want to get the milestone ready by Friday or something. So
yeah. Yeah, I
that's
think it's great.
yeah,
And I think it's interesting. I don't know if you have any friends that are kind of like a generation maybe older than we are, but they've never had this reservation of just picking up the phone and calling you, right? So like whenever I was kind of getting a phone call from someone, it was usually from kind of my older friends, who just wanted to like see how I'm doing, and like they, like why would they email me, right? Or text me? And it's kind of funny. Like I think these types of phone calls, like I I don't approve of them in a work environment because I think that's like an anti-pattern to basically cause an interrupt for the other person, right? When
yeah,
you should be helping them focus, right? On the social level, I think as long as we have the right tools for people to be able to like put their phone on do not disturb and not feel like
yeah,
they have to pick up, I think it requires some social change for it to be acceptable not to pick up the phone, right?
exactly.
And to put it on do not disturb and not have someone then text you like why are you not picking up and all of that, right? But
Yeah,
I think as long as we have those sort of the ground rules, then yeah, I think a lot of the time it's much better, right?
yeah. It's still like I'm a huge fan of calling people when I wouldn't say I have a feeling when they're free, but just talking about it like, hey, are you free tomorrow or something, and then randomly call them, I think that's more appropriate.
Right.
But then again, if you call someone in a meeting and you call them again and you call them again, like that's very rude.
Right.
Don't do that. But yeah. And then I think also so Yak, YAC is also a very interesting company. They do like async audio and video conversations. Well, not like messaging.
Right.
And they have sort of the approach of making voice messages nice, because
Right.
I used to hate voice messages, but I like them more now because it's sort of like a very compressed phone call, like by in one direction phone call. And what they do is they transcript the message, and you can search inside the audio file and make it look
Interesting.
nice. So that's something I want to try more. Right now, I don't really have a team to do that, but
Yeah.
that's definitely interesting to try. And yeah, I think voice messages is also like the next thing over phone calls, because also phone calls require you to be synced, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was working on a startup. Well, one of my previous companies were building effectively what you're describing, which is kind of like a asynchronous walkie-talkie
Oh, cool.
type of
Yeah.
tool, right?
Nice.
And I think we figured, and maybe the transcripts are kind of like the key feature there. We found that it was easy to create and just hit a button and respond, but it was much harder to, like, as soon as you introduced any time zone differences, it became a little bit silly because you sort of had to like listen through to other people having the conversation. Like scanning text is much faster,
Ah,
right?
yeah. Yeah.
So I think that wasn't terribly exciting, and I think that's why personally I'm not, for at least for our company, tools like Tandem and some of those other folks that do the kind of like more persistent voice and video
Yeah.
channels, they just don't click with me personally. I think they're great tools for the types of companies that would be on Slack all day, right? Where like you would have this like constant chatter with your team members, right? Then moving
Right.
some of that to a voice channel, I think is a great improvement, right?
Yeah.
So if you're that type of company, I think those tools are amazing. For a company that's a little bit more distributed and leans more on asynchronous, we haven't found them to be that useful for anything really.
Yeah.
But I'm intrigued. I mean, you kind of see. I don't know if that's the case with your company as well, but like there's the video recording tools are also like becoming pretty popular. We used to have an app called I mean, it's technically still on the App Store. We had an app called Tapes, that it basically is a simpler version of Loom, right? But but Loom is also great, and they that I think is a very interesting form of communication that is still underused, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it's not just voice, it's visual, so you don't feel like you are just wasting time listening to someone's like voicemail, you know. You're actually, they're trying to explain to you something visual, but it's asynchronous. You don't have to like jump on a Zoom call to do that. So I'm a big fan of Loom,
Yeah.
and
Loom
that
is
form of
great.
communication.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
haven't found I haven't found the voice only counterpart that would make sense for our use case.
Right, makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I remember also doing presentations over Loom. It's just someone can rewatch it, someone can comment on the specific time. Like that's some like
Yeah.
give a heart or like download, upvote. You can easily share it. It's much easier to share
Yeah.
something. You can put a password on it. I think what when entrepreneurs shy away from sending a deck, like that's totally fine, because it removes the entrepreneur. It puts too much focus on the
Right.
business and less on the entrepreneur. But if you send a Loom with your own face, with your own way of expressing things and explaining the slide behind you,
Yeah.
that's a whole new way of presenting.
Yeah.
And
Have you seen
yeah.
Ahum, or whatever
Yeah,
the
yeah, 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 yeah.
Mhm.
Love
or
it.
whatever
I
the
love it.
however
Yeah.
you pronounce that name? Yeah, I thought it was really interesting. I haven't
It's from the all turtle
tried
guys,
it
right?
personally
Yeah.
yet,
Yeah.
but it seemed like that kind of connecting the sort of the video aspect with a presentation, I think is a very
That's
interesting,
very cool. Yeah.
it's a very interesting product. Yeah.
And the great thing is that it's working on the video signal, so you can use it on any platform like Zoom. Like
Right.
they don't try to replace Zoom, and yeah, there's going to be a bunch of companies built on top these audio signals, like Crisp, you said in the
Yeah.
pre-recording, and great name, by the way.
Right.
Yeah, I'm very excited to how this place will like this whole remote industry will evolve. It's definitely a huge, gigantic market, and yeah,
Right.
if any one of your listeners want to go into that space, you can find Matt. Hey, Matt, where can they find you?
Where can they find me? I used to be on Twitter, but I don't think I am that active there anymore. I think the best is still probably email. I'm a little bit old school that way, so you can always just ping me at matt@pilot.co, and I'm happy to respond there. If you ping me on Twitter, I'll probably see it, but I don't know if I'll respond. I'm MATID on Twitter, so.
Awesome. Yeah. So my name is Pierre. I'm the co-host and host from Lean Hire from the Lean Hire podcast. And yeah, thank you so much for joining, Matt. This was great. This was a very, very interesting conversation about the future of work.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having
Cool.
me on.
Take care. Bye.
Bye bye.